Airing first on Asheville FM, this is The Final Straw, a weekly anarchist, anti-authoritarian radio show broadcasting from occupied Saligi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from people, projects, and struggles around the world engaging in the long project toward liberation. You can email us with questions or suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or at protonmail.com, or send us letters at P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina 28816. This week, I got the chance to sit down with Olive and Yousef of the Durham NC-based eviction defense group HEDS-Up. HEDS-Up stands for Housing Eviction Defense Solidarity, and is a group which formed in Durham, North Carolina when COVID was first hitting the area and folks' housing was becoming more and more unstable. We get to talk about a lot of topics in this episode, among which are gentrification in Durham, what the North Carolina eviction process might look like, and about the group's handbook, the Eviction Defense Handbook, Volume 1312, which can be found on their website, can'tpaywon'tpaydurm.org. This handbook is extensively written and researched and was put together by HEDS-Up for educational and empowerment purposes. It covers topics from abolition to how one might structure an eviction defense team, pertinent information regarding COVID and evictions, how to look up information on a specific property, a step-by-step of what to expect in eviction court, and many more topics.
The Final Straw Radio is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
I'm Kami.
And I'm Franz, and together we are co-hosts of the Doomer vs. Bloomer podcast on the Channel Zero network.
Every week I'm going to complain about how the world is fucked, things are definitely going to get worse before they get better, and we're all probably going to die.
And I disagree with Kami and think that having hope is important. We can make things better, but only if we believe we can and put in all the effort we're able to into organizing against capitalism and the state.
Yeah, we'll see.
That's the core of our podcast, y'all. It's our shtick. We disagree.
Find our show on SoundCloud or wherever you find podcasts, and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Doomer v. Bloomer.
And here are a few announcements we'd like to share. First up, the Wabanaki Community Herbal Apothecary in so-called Maine is working to support their tribal communities during these COVID-19 outbreaks. They're asking for herbal medicine and medicine-making supplies or monetary donations to support their efforts. The supplies list can be found at their FedBook page, which is listed in our show notes. And monetary donations can go to their fiscal sponsor, Why Hunger, which can be found at whyhunger.org/EW Rematriation. You can contact livemore16, that's LIVMOORE 16 at gmail.com for coordination and more details. Lauren Reed is a 26-year-old Diné or Navajo man residing in the small town of Page, Arizona, who is facing 10 years for comments left on FedBook during the nationwide protests because some dumbass white man with no scruples or sense of humor reported him to the cops. There's a breakdown of his case available at forgiveeveryone.com/blog, also linked in our show notes. At the end of that, you can find Lauren's address and tips for writing him, as well as how to put money on his commissary, how to make donations to Tucson Anti-Repression Crew, which is doing his legal support. You can do that via Cash App with $Tucson ARC, or on PayPal by finding Prisoner Support, noting for Lauren Reed in the comment. Here's a little bit about Santos Torres from Philly Anti-Repression on Twitter. As of last week, Santo Torres Olan, number ML7947, a comrade of Dwayne Stats of the Vaughn 17, is on a hunger strike at SCI Albion. He's protesting the physical, psychological, and emotional abuses at Albion. The prison administration uses meals, showers, rec, and mail as a form of punishment, retaliation, and psychological torture. His protest is against the prison system as a whole. Santos has also been charged with assaulting a guard and the courts, public defender, and prosecutors are trying to railroad him. He ended up having to go pro se, or to defend himself legally, in order to fight his case. Help out Santos' struggle against the prison system by calling SCI Albion at 814-756-5778. Ask to speak to the superintendent and make sure they know that people on the outside are paying close attention to their torture and abuse of prisoners. Our incarcerated comrades are struggling against prison on a whole different level. We must support them from the outside when they ask us for help. Another announcement. Jay Chase, the last defendant of the 2012 NATO 3 conspiracy case, is finally fucking free. You can give money to his post-release fund in order to help get him on his feet by visiting GoFundMe.com and searching for J Case NATO 3. Welcome out, Jay. In more prison news, Jorge Cornell is a prisoner that has $2 and recently was moved to Fort Dix. Jorge has high blood pressure and sleep apnea. He is obese and borderline diabetic. This, along with a previous heart attack, make him high risk. Jorge is a friend of many in Central North Carolina organizing communities. As an outspoken community activist, candidate for city council, and police critic, Jorge was frequently targeted by law enforcement. Despite beating dozens of bogus charges prior to his current incarceration, Jorge is currently being wrongfully held thanks to overly broad RICO laws and targeting by the FBI, leading to a trial and conviction in 2012. He maintains his innocence, but still has 15 years left on an unjust 28-year-long sentence. If you want to learn more, you can hear 2 interviews from 2013 that we conducted by visiting our website and searching ALKQN. And we'll have more details in the show notes of how you can work to get a compassionate release for Jorge concerning his health. Finally, a regular listener, Jay, in Aotearoa, brought to our attention this week the passing of anarchist prisoner Brian Caswell McCarville in the so-called state of Oregon. Brian McCarville was a radical social prisoner who in the early 2000s was involved in taking the Oregon Department of Corrections to court, challenging their censorship and rejection of anarchist publications for prisoners with his cellmate Rob Thaxton, aka Rob Los Ricos. The ODOC was attempting to declare anarchists to be members of a security threat group, sort of like a gang, based on their shared political tendencies, the use of language and symbols, their stances of to protest unfair circumstances, etc. By winning the court case, he forced the Oregon prison system to allow anarchist materials into the prisons. Brian had terrible health problems, and following his victory in the court case, he was punished for a long time by authorities for taking that stand. He passed on his 68th birthday, September 27th, 2020, from causes unknown to us. Rise in power, Brian.
Hi, I'm Yousef, and I use he or they pronouns, and I do some work with HEDS-Up in Durham.
And I'm Olive, and I use she and they pronouns, and I also do work with HEDS-Up in Durham.
So y'all have written a fairly extensive handbook of your work and of sort of possible shapes that this kind of work can take, and tips and tricks for organizing in other cities. And it starts off with a sort of a land back statement. Would you talk about land back, how land back relates to eviction defense and the work that you do with HEDS-Up?
First, we could start by reading the land acknowledgement from the handbook, and then maybe we can go into kind of more what it means. And we wrote this I know that sometimes land acknowledgements can be really superficial. They aren't really common too much in the so-called United States, so we just tried to write one that we were doing our best, but I felt at the same time knowing that it's inadequate. So it goes like this.
We are grateful for the land, air, and water that sustain us. We're especially grateful for the rivers and creeks as places that offer an oasis for so many in this area. Grateful for the streams that form in the street when it rains as rivers guiding our steps. We acknowledge that settler colonialism is an ongoing process, and we hope that this acknowledgement can be a step in recognizing the continued colonization of this land and its people, and the inadequacy of calling this place so-called Durham, North Carolina. As we reclaim this space here today, we acknowledge the violence that it took to colonize this land, to cultivate this land, to mine this land, to log this land, and to, quote, develop this land. We would like to acknowledge, to the best of our inadequate understandings, the Catawba, Occaneechi, Eno, Tuscarora, Saponi, and Shakori peoples. This is native land, and white people in Durham occupy it as settlers and colonizers. We would also like to acknowledge indigenous resistance to the settler colonial state that motivates and inspires our actions. Just to name a few, encampments such as the Unistoten camp on unceded Wet'suwet'en territory, to rail blockades such as the Tyendinaga Mohawk Territory camp in so-called Ontario, Canada, on unceded land, to the ongoing Kumeyaay and Tohono O'odham resistance to the border wall on the illegitimate USA-Mexico border.
Yeah, I love that. I love that y'all included that too. Like, as a, settler or invader on this land myself, like, I've been very influenced by the work that's going on up there in so-called Canada, with Indigenous defense and Indigenous sovereignty struggles. So, like, thanks y'all for including that and for being sensitive to the ongoing, like, violences of settler colonialism.
Yeah, I think that, like, when we talking about evictions and eviction defense on stolen land, I think that sort of challenging the culture that, like, enshrines this colonial concept of land ownership is an important part, like a small but important part of a process of decolonizing, and that defending against evictions is part of work that creates a culture that recognizes housing as a human need and a human right, and that, like, draws attention to the fact that charging rent for stolen land is theft, on top of claiming ownership of stolen land. And I think that, like, doing eviction defenses sort of opens up and makes visible the fact that there are possibilities of and ways to relate to land and place and home outside of the way that we are sort of programmed to think about land and place and home by the colonial project of the U.S.
Yeah, absolutely.
As we, like, approach this work of eviction defense, and that's the word that we call it, but it's like kicking somebody out of their home, and how that, like, just relates to land and how people relate to the land that they're on and how they're disconnected from that are kind of all things that, we keep in mind in this work, and how to break that isolation. And that's kind of something that we'll keep on coming back to, and kind of why we're motivated to do this.
It's reminding me a little bit of, I had the opportunity to talk to somebody who was involved in the reclamation of a Sheraton hotel in Minneapolis, who was stating that a lot of, like, the folks who lived there were, like, formerly unhoused people, a lot of whom were Black and Indigenous, and folks who were Indigenous were stating that, like, having that hotel felt like getting their land back. And that's really what, like, resonated with me with the land acknowledgement at the beginning of the handbook that y'all wrote. Maybe before we get into anything more, like, nitty-gritty, would you just talk a little bit about HEDS-Up and how this group began in Durham?
Yeah, we began working together, like, in this form kind of right when the pandemic started. We came out of kind of pre-existing communities and networks of people with similar affinities who formed around, like, the international calls for rent strikes on April 1st and May 1st. And, like, this began kind of just as people talking of being like, hey, like, COVID's happening, like, what the fuck are we going to do? And also a lot of people were losing their jobs, and were worried about making rent or having to go into workplaces where it was just unsafe. And so like it began as an effort like focused around education and kind of just like through being on the internet, which kind of at that time felt like one of the only things you could do. So we just had a social media, had a website, and we looked to projects in so-called Seattle, Richmond, and Austin as models early on for how to move forward. We were at that time, and our social media is still under this name, but at that time we were organizing under Can't Pay, Won't Pay. And we would often fall back on saying to ourselves as to like why we do this work and why it's so important. Kind of in that moment, it was like, if we can't pay alone, then let's not pay together. And that just felt really important as the idea of like a debt strike or a rent strike as something that gave people power. So we started providing resources on like how to find out who owns your land, how to form like tenant associations in your building, and kind of just like some basics on tenant organizing. And that was mostly just like signal boosting, like Autonomous Tenants Union in Chicago, LA Tenants Union, I think Philly Tenants Union, and Tank in the Bay Area. They all have excellent tenant organizing guides, and like they were prepared and they were ready. And then kind of as the pandemic went on, we just developed a much deeper analysis, and we were building relationships with each other at the same time that kind of formed the basis for where we are today. And kind of as all of this was happening, we were also figuring out like how could we still be in the streets? How could we still like make some sort of confrontational presence around this? Because at that time it felt like things did feel wholly more disconnected than they do now, even though that like COVID cases are, you know, in a lot of places much worse than they were back then. So we were organizing like car parades, which was like as a tactic, it was a really joyful procession through town. We stayed in the neighborhoods, like avoided the central business district and downtown, and people loved it. We had signs, we made noise, we did them on the weekends when people were out, people cheered, we blocked traffic. They were all really fun, and it was just kind of like cancel rent parade is what we were calling them. And probably one of the most heartwarming moments that I did want to share from that time, because it was something that we found really endearing and really important, was that we heard from this person who's a teacher, and the teacher said that they had a student, and for show and tell, the student brought a video of a parade, and the teacher asked, what was it for? And the student responded, to cancel rent. And the teacher said, I wish I was there. And that really just like hit us in a way when we were like, oh, we could like maybe do something together that could affect others. And I guess as we're talking about like who HEDS-Up is and how we got to this place, the central part of it is the uprising. So kind of as things turned in like April became May, and people were not making rent, but also there's not necessarily widespread like rent strikes happening, we definitely kind of entered a stage where we were like, okay, well, we're going to start working more directly with communities. We kind of felt like more prepared at that point. And that kind of happened right as the uprising started. So there was a lot going on, but I feel like that's really when we began to take a turn towards kind of this thing that we've been just calling like trauma-informed organizing. And also we became much more geared towards abolition, and kind of the work started to affect us in a deeper way. And we can talk more on abolition later. But that kind of brings us up to the uprising. HEDS-Up eventually formed. We kind of have a thing going on where our social media is sort of different from our on-the-ground organizing presence, and that's intentional. So much can get wrapped up in what like an Instagram account is or what a Twitter account is, and a lot of that can be so irrelevant to like the material needs of people. So that's kind of when we started focusing specifically on eviction defense, and we kind of changed our name to HEDS-Up, which stands for Housing Eviction Defense Solidarity. And we kind of, not necessarily formalized, but we started working together towards that one goal, which has resulted in the creation of this handbook, along with multiple eviction defense workshops in Durham, and kind of more stuff planned. We've also been working directly with tenants, just kind of like signal boosting phones apps that have been successful and kind of using those kinds of pressure tactics. But a lot of this is it's like a learning process for us, and it's like, how would we do an eviction defense? We have almost engaged in an eviction defense multiple times with people, but we've never actually gotten to that point yet. So part of this project is also how to, like, we ourselves get prepared for what we know is going to be necessary.
Yeah, absolutely, especially as winter is like rolling right on in. Yousef, did you have anything you wanted to add to this topic?
I kind of was in and out throughout that evolution of HEDS-Up. And so, yeah, I think that Olive's perspective is really helpful in describing sort of like the continuity of that.
And there are definitely certain things that I want to touch on that you were talking about, Olive, later in the interview, but I would love to hear about the group's specific abolitionist orientation, and again, like how abolition relates to eviction defense in y'all's thinking and in y'all's praxis, or maybe not praxis for the radio, but just in y'all's thinking.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that, and I'll feel free to jump in. But I think that kind of sort of as the uprising started to gain steam towards the end of the spring, I think that we were forced to reckon with kind of a lot of different facets of the ways that abolition interacted with our work at the same time. And sort of like Olive mentioned, sort of being forced to really center like community care and doing our organizing in a way that was trauma informed, because like it was a traumatic time for a lot of us, and also eviction is a traumatic event. And I think that like it became really important to us to look at how caring for each other and making space for trauma and for the ways that mental illness shows up, and for being conscious of ableism around mental health, but obviously also all kinds of ableism in organizing and how that interacts with policing and the prison industrial complex, and sort of how caring for each other is something that is an absolute necessity, because the way that the state deals with trauma and with mental illness is carceral. And so that was one way that our work started to intersect more with abolition as the uprising started. But then also we wanted to move more towards doing work that was more directly confrontational to the police and the state, and the way that sheriffs and police enforce evictions and sort of protect property and land holdings. And so we moved more from just informing and spreading information about what sort of rights are legally protected and when those rights expire, and how to track evictions happening, and how to sort of understand the court processes around eviction, and to focus more on how people can directly resist evictions. And Olive and others led a workshop as part of a series happening in Durham called Abolish and Reclaim, a workshop specifically around eviction defense. And so most recently we've been doing a lot more directly working with tenants to confront their landlords. We recently boosted a phone app that a tenant put together to pressure her landlord because he was attempting an illegal eviction and was refusing to accept rent relief. And that phone app was thankfully successful. And that, along with us moving towards also doing court support and showing up at eviction court in solidarity with folks facing evictions, and to offer sort of materials and information about folks' legal and other recourses when dealing with eviction has sort of characterized the shift that we are kind of undergoing right now as a result of the ways that the uprising has really forced us to more deeply integrate abolition into the ways that we think and do things.
Yeah, that sounds very inspiring, and also I really like the sort of when you were talking, Yousef, the patterns of trying to sort of instill a community care model and how sort of lacking our general society is in doing community care, because I feel like neoliberalism really wants everybody to be this kind of island and to not really accept community care in a divide and conquer kind of way. And the way that abolition and eviction defense is community care work is, I think those strains run so deep. I would really love to hear more about the trauma-informed organizing. That is somehow a phrase that I have not heard, but it really resonates with me, especially in these times. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that, just what that is and what that looks like for y'all.
Yeah, trauma-informed organizing, that is just something that we were kind of saying amongst ourselves as kind of a way to, I guess, better approach organizing. And one thing that maybe we can touch on is just kind of the violence of nonprofits. And many of us are ex-nonprofit people that at one time or another were involved, and it was a harmful experience. And I think that a lot of, just to speak for myself, not wanting to replicate these harmful systems is something that I take really seriously when I engage in this kind of work, not wanting to replicate harm that's already been caused. So kind of just being we're going to start organizing, or we're going to organize, or community organizing, to me just comes off as oh, that is going to hurt some people, whether it's the employees or whether it's maybe the people that you're quote organizing. There's the potential for harm. So that's kind of one part of it, kind of where we through our personal experiences have it, but also just working directly with tenants and hearing about how harmful eviction is and where people are at and hearing their stories, which is a lot of kind of what this thing that people call organizing is. It's really building relationships with others and building relationships of trust that can, hopefully build in relationships of solidarity where you'll have people and people will know that they have you. So we were trying, with kind of this whole trauma-informed organizing thing that we say amongst ourselves, it's trying to be aware of what circumstances people are in and also be aware of our own circumstances, where are we at? And being deeply involved in all of this kind of work can also be really harmful. There's, all sorts of burnout and other harmful patterns that can emerge in this work. And it was actually on a Final Straw interview, the one about legal repression, or the panel that was recently, and somebody, I forgot who it was, but somebody said this thing about sort of working when you're feeling really manic, and that really resonated with me when I heard those words, and it just kind of hit me, and it's just this started out definitely as a project in reaction to the circumstances, because we were also scared about losing our places that we were going to live. So, working from that to where maybe, oh, we have a sense of security now, we might have figured it out, but others might not. Others might still be in crisis. So trying to do this work and approach it in a way that you're not just going to cause harm by treating people as a thing to be organized or a number for the base building effort, but really try and make it so people who you're working with are as much a part of a process as you, and you're providing a sense of solidarity that is built in trust and knowing one another.
Yeah, I think so much of it is really, and also as a disclaimer, I think that trauma-informed organizing is a thing that we say amongst ourselves is definitely like an aspirational thing and not a thing that I don't think that anybody has figured out yet. But I think that like a lot of it is really just about genuine and like honest relationships, and just like I think that so like a lot of I have a lot of experience and like a lot of traumatizing experience as a former, specifically a like quote unquote movement nonprofit worker, and I think a lot of like the violence that I saw happen in sort of in the name of like base building. And I think that like for me, like I get antsy when I hear that language, and I like to talk about community building, because I think that a lot of times when organizing work that's geared towards like we have to like activate this base of people involves a lot of like kind of disingenuous and insincere relationship building, where like people who are like organizers go and act like they want to like be somebody's friend and like be in their life and care about them, when they are only caring about this person in a very conditional way because of the particular circumstance that they're in, or like in sort of like union organizing context, like because of the job that they have, and like when somebody leaves that job, or in a like so that like these relationships end and they're not genuine. And I don't think that when I think about community building, I don't think that necessarily means that you have to like be somebody's like ride or die friend all the time, but it does involve just being honest and real and interacting with people as a person, and offering what you can sincerely offer, and engaging with folks in a way that is honest. And I think also another big part of it is dealing with moments when our friends or community members or folks that we're interacting with are like dealing with mental illness and traumatic circumstances in ways that aren't always cute, and holding that and sitting with and doing the work of unpacking all of the like really carceral stigmas around mental health, and finding ways to like show up for people in those moments outside of the ways that we've been trained to, which are like usually either to ignore or turn away from things that make us uncomfortable, or to like want to outsource the care of people to in this like carceral way. Yeah, I think that that work of sort of like unpacking internalized ableism stuff is a really important part of that.
Definitely. Yeah, thanks y'all both so much for going into that. I was, really struck by when you said trauma-informed organizing, because it seems to me like a provocation, because I think that for as like versed as anarchists are in a trauma language, like we have a fairly developed and nuanced, in my opinion, like way that we talk about trauma, but in organizing it is still sort of viewed as something to avoid, something to like don't make a decision based in trauma, because that's not like a real decision, and in a way that is showing a little bit of bigotry or showing a little bit of fear, or not really acknowledging that trauma really has like a very systemic effect on somebody's whole being, and so I really love that. It, to me, like that the phrase just seems to center that, and in a way that I think is really helpful. So I think like thank you both so much for introducing me and us to that phrase, because that's something I'm gonna be thinking about for a long time.
Yeah, and I guess just the last small bit on that phrase is, as important as all of those other things are that we've been talking about, it's also about dealing with harm internally. That just kind of will inevitably come up. when you're working with other people. So that's kind of also another part of it. And if we're going to be talking about abolition and a world without police, a world without prisons, a world without bosses or landlords and all of these things, then we need to be prepared for what that actually means. So in the sense, I like the idea that it's a provocation, because I also want to acknowledge it's a provocation towards that.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that. This is the Final Straw Radio. I am your host, William Goodenough, and this week you're listening to Olive and Yousef, who are two organizers in Durham, North Carolina, talk about the eviction defense platform HEDS-Up, which stands for Housing Eviction Defense Solidarity. So we have been talking about evictions. I am wondering if y'all would be willing to sort of sketch a portrait of how you've seen evictions usually proceed for anyone who isn't really familiar, and how HEDS-Up or another similar formation could like plug into that process.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I'll be saying is specific to North Carolina, but the eviction process, while it's not the same everywhere, it often has similar steps. So obviously, like, research what the eviction process is like where you live. And when, like, talking about the eviction process, there's multiple ways that people can be evicted. The most common one that we focused on, and this is sort of like a shortcoming, but also a place to look for other things that are happening. So we're mostly focusing on if you miss rent. But it's important to acknowledge there's many other ways that people can be legally evicted, including criminalization, which is very common, calling the cops on people and getting them arrested, or having the cops come and that being reason to evict somebody. And also, when we're talking about evictions right here, first there'll be the legal process, and there's an illegal process of eviction, or lawful and unlawful. I think I like that language a little bit better. So for like the lawful eviction process, let's just say something happens. So we'll just say the tenant misses rent. The tenant has 5 days to pay rent, which is until the 5th. And then at that point, the landlord can provide the tenant with a 10-day notice. And after that 10-day notice to pay rent, the landlord can file what's called a summary ejectment, which is the paperwork that the landlord files in the county clerk's office to start the lawful eviction process. And one thing to note about all this paperwork stuff is the landlord pays a little bit of money to do that, because you pay the clerks to evict somebody, and then the landlords, they get this money back in the settlement. So I guess it's also important to acknowledge when somebody's being evicted, they're also having to pay for the whole process of them being evicted, which is like something we see very commonly in the prison system as well. So once the summary ejectment is filed by the landlord, it's received and processed by the county clerk's office, and at that point, a hearing is scheduled. So when we first started this off, the courts were closed for a while. They were closed, I think it was either into early June, and then in North Carolina, there was another order to stop, have an eviction moratorium until the end of June 21st or something. So after June 21st, that's when the eviction courts kind of started to open up again. So when COVID started, there was a big delay in the process, which is one of the reasons why so many people jumped to eviction defense work right away, because it's kind of like a once-in-a-lifetime thing. The courts stopped. It's completely unprecedented. So it was an opening, and that's one thing to acknowledge. So once the clerk schedules the hearing, the sheriff receives it and delivers it to the tenant, which is often just posting it on the door if they can't get a hold of you. But by posting it on the door, that's delivering the summons that you have to go to court. And that's the first point that the sheriff can get involved. After that, the tenant will go to a court hearing. After the court hearing, the magistrate makes a decision. It's kind of, once the tenant receives the summary ejectment, that would be the point for them to get a lawyer or contact legal aid to try to get representation. in North Carolina, or at least maybe this is in Durham specifically, there's, I think, only about 10% of tenants have representation in court, which is incredibly low. And one way that we've seen that's kind of been how the progressive establishment responds to the eviction crisis is the city throwing more money at legal aid so people have representation, along with there being law clinics at universities in town that also help provide people for representation in that process. And while representation is of course important, it's not even a Band-Aid, because most every decision the magistrate makes is in favor of the landlord. And only if you get a lawyer do you probably have a chance to maybe not have a judgment against you. So after the magistrate's decision, there's a 10-day appeal period. If you don't appeal and the magistrate rules in favor of the landlord, a writ of possession is issued. A writ of possession it's like the legal document that kicks you out of your house, to put it in loose terms. It's the thing that once the landlord serves it, that's the moment when they can padlock what is your home, and then all of a sudden you're trespassing on somebody's private property if you're still there after that writ of possession is served. And it's also important to acknowledge that the only way the lawful eviction process works is through the courts. The sheriff has to be involved and the courts have to be involved. Under no circumstances can a landlord evict you from your house. That would be unlawful eviction, or sometimes called a self-help eviction. So if you appeal at that 10-day judgment period, it is sent to district court, and this is advantageous because it delays the process. And when the process is delayed, you still need to be paying rent, but there's ways to file motions in the court to where, if you don't have money, you don't have money, and there's a legal term for that I forget, but it basically means you don't have to pay. So if you appeal it and it gets sent to district court, you at least can delay the process a little longer. And when we've talked to tenant lawyers, they are often that's the best option, which to us is just inadequate, doesn't even describe that. Yes, a delay would be nice, but it doesn't actually solve the issue at hand. So it's really rare that a tenant has a successful appeal, and if they have an unsuccessful appeal after they're hearing in district court and they get sent back, the writ of possession will be issued and the sheriff will serve it and the tenant would be locked out of their house. So there's multiple places to intervene in this, and in our handbook, we kind of are going to keep on releasing new versions of our handbook, and we're going to make the handbook much more public in the next few weeks. But one of the ways that we intervene through our work is through court support, and that would kind of be during the court hearing. That would be when people are coming into court, we're at court, we're set up outside with information, and we're talking to people, we're inside with information, we're talking to people at eviction court, and we're handing them the Cdc Declaration. So the Cdc Declaration is this, I don't know what it's a legal document put out by the Centers for Disease Control that basically stops the eviction process until December 31st, January 1st. But the tenant still owes back rent, but it does stop the eviction process. So that is kind of the most important interventions people can do now by showing up to court and talking to people who are facing eviction, is making sure they have that CDC declaration and know how to make it a legally binding thing, which is basically you have a copy, you sign it, you have a copy, you sign it, and you give it to your landlord. And then that should legally stop the process of eviction.
It
Unlawful
unfortunately
evictions
only works to stop the eviction process if the reason for eviction that the landlord names is failure to pay rent.
Yeah, that's totally true. And it's a COVID thing. So by signing the declaration, you are signing a legal document, and you're saying that because of COVID, you can't pay your rent, and that is why the landlord is trying to evict you. So yeah, thank you for mentioning that. So I guess the other part is the unlawful eviction process. That can happen sort of at any time, but usually tenants kind of have some sort of heads up that their landlord is trying to illegally evict them. Sometimes the landlord will tell them, or sometimes maybe they'll know that something is up. And unlawful evictions can take the form of like retaliation, harassment, abuse of landlords to tenants, just kind of forcing somebody out of their home. Like we've heard stories of landlords like drilling people's deadbolts out as like a way to get them out, like not making repairs, like all the shitty things that landlords do to try to get you out of your house. That's like also part of the unlawful eviction process, which is a common way that people are kicked out of their homes.
It's such a, like, you know, like with anything associated with a court, such a weird, long, complex procedure. And I think that they probably like it that way, just because it's harder to interface with given those circumstances. But thank you for breaking down, like, kind of opaque process. I think it's good for people to understand, like, what all's involved.
Yeah, and I guess the little thing I'll add is, like, there's multiple interventions that you can make, and, like, one thing I will sort of note is, like, sort of like tenant union organizing and people organizing buildings, like, provides an opportunity to, like, get in relationship with people and just, like, before they miss rent or when they just miss rent. So I also wanted to acknowledge that, like, that work is also really important. We don't directly engage in, like, organizing buildings or whatever, but that's an intervention. And then the intervention of eviction defense would happen in, like, the final step when the sheriff comes to issue the writ of possession and lock the person, like, padlock the person out of their home.
Kind of on that tip, one of the questions that I had is the ways in which eviction defense is paramount to healthy tenant organizing. Would y'all care to speak a bit more on that?
Yeah, I think one thing that we kind of talk about amongst ourselves is, I guess we're not too connected to, like, oh, we're doing tenant organizing. I feel like we're more connected to, like, we're doing community defense. Because it's great to have an organized building, but once you're out of that building, you might still, like, have people, but you don't have those same people who you were organizing with, who, like, might have had your back because they live next door or something. So I guess that, like, I would just say that, like, eviction defense is like paramount to, like, a strong community defense. And part of that is having, like, renters that are organized. And by that, meaning, like, in relationship with each other, supporting each other, like, fighting for each other, and taking care of each other. And those are, like, more the aspirational things, but there's a lot of other things that harm also comes with that. So I think that's also why we focus so much on, like, abolition and eviction defense, is because we're not just trying to get a bunch of organized tenants. We're just trying to do a thing where we're creating, like, very strong and resilient communities that can resist the forces of, like, racial capitalism in the state and the police.
Yeah. And that was something that I really loved when I read that the version of the handbook that y'all forwarded to me, was the sort of very intentional, very explicitly laid out position of, like, this is information. We're not, like, offering a service. We're, like, offering information. You know, it was really, I was really favorably impressed by that. One thing that you also talk about or touch on in the handbook a little bit, you intentionally don't really talk about, like, mechanisms of displacement or, you know, gentrification, just due to the lack of time and space, because, you know, those things really could fill books. But would you care to elaborate on that topic here a little bit in relation to sort of the kinds of things you've been seeing and experiencing, and what sorts of, like, patterns of displacement is HEDS-Up aware of and sensitive to?
Yeah, I think that gentrification and displacement are such an enormous force in Durham that's behind evictions and also behind policing of all kinds in, like, really complex ways. It really could fill books. But I think that the ways that gentrification and sort of the introduction of, like, new luxury and expensive housing developments in Durham has like really, really directly resulted in escalated displacement and police violence in Durham in a really alarming way for many, many years. I sort of grew up in Durham, and so seeing the ways that gentrification is escalating and like really snowballing over time is really something. And I think also like because of the ways that gentrification and like wealthy white folks moving in to neighborhoods, and specifically like Durham as a place that has this like, or had this reputation as a black city with a lot of like gun violence, has really shown up in more policing. And I think that like in 2018 there was this struggle between a homeless encampment that was across the street from this new condo development that it had been built, I think, the year before, but 2018, I think, was the year when like people had like moved in and it was like largely occupied, this like new condo development. And directly as a result of like lots of calls from that condo development, that encampment was raided and destroyed by the city of Durham and by the police. And so it's caused a lot of like not only landlord-tenant eviction type processes, but also a like general criminalization and heightened criminalization of homelessness, and also like these other forms of eviction or of like forcing people out of the places where they are living outside of even having a formal home. And I think also, as we look at the eviction court dockets, the realty companies and landlords that are like filling these dockets are the ones that are flipping houses, that do things like neglecting housing units just for the purpose of displacing tenants so that those units can be flipped. And yeah, I'm sure that Olive has more to add on this topic as well.
Yeah, Durham is such a cesspool for this stuff. It's like gay cops, gay landlords. Like, fuck them all. Just because, like, Durham is such, like, a progressive gay city or whatever, that it's just, like, these same people do, like, such horrible things while at the same time white gay people especially use their identity but also wealth just to dominate the city. And I think that like about gentrification, like people have been talking about this for years now, and I just think one important part of our analysis is that and in Durham this is especially true, displacement, and this kind of relates back to some of the like the first question, it's kind of always the perennial issue. Like land has always been something that the state or colonial force or the police or like capital has been trying to push people off of and take from people and make sure it's scarce and make sure it's unavailable and make sure it's violent. So, you know, when we see like another new restaurant downtown or like another new condo, we know it's the same as when they raised the Hayti to build an interstate. We know it's the same when they built the new police precinct on the east side of town. We know it's the same when there was probably the same realty companies that still exist now doing redlining. And like, we know it's the same when they talk about how wonderful downtown is. And like specifically in Durham, there's kind of a history of DPAC, the Durham Performing Arts Center, which was built in, I believe, 2008. And it was kind of the centerpiece of what has now become like a, you know, it's like they would say, like a beautiful and revitalized downtown Durham. And the Durham Performing Arts Center was kind of in part there because of this company called Capitol Broadcasting Company, which also owns one of the notoriously evil news stations in town that constantly like tries to film protesters' faces and is posts mugshots on their website. And they also own the minor league baseball team in town that's just down the street from the Durham Performing Arts Center. But the thing that's just, it's kind of shocking because like there'll be jail demos down at the jail, which is right across from the Durham Performing Arts Center and right next to brand new condos in the courthouse. And it's really shocking that like they literally put the jail and the new condos and the courthouse right next to the Fancy Performing Arts Center. Like, you couldn't say it any better by just like looking down Mangum Street and seeing what the end result of like all of this is. But I think also, like, in terms of specific like trends and patterns that we see, and I think that Durham is like, you know, like a place where things have been happening for a while. We just saw this article just came out about this company that's trying to like manufacture modular and like manufactured homes, which just feels like such a joke, because like that's like literally what they try and sell to poor people as like inadequate housing, and sometimes it's like the best thing people can get, but it's like praised in the media as like the solution for affordable housing. And there's a giant push to do all these rezoning regulations that would allow like people to build a second building on their lot where they could like then have tenants. Just there's a massive amount of condos going in, and a lot of them just seem to be absolutely empty. And like don't know what's up with that. Like, we haven't really like researched a lot of that really intensely, but I mean, those are all just kind of trends that we're seeing, and it's rapidly accelerating here is kind of what I would say. And it's been accelerating for, I don't know, I mean, people who are from here can speak better to this than me, but to my best guess, at least like 15, 20 years.
Yeah, that all is, yes. Thank you for going into that, and also thank you for bringing up the whole like luxury tiny home thing that I see popping up a lot. I'm just like, motherfucker, you have like fucking reinvented the trailer. You like, fuck you, basically, and are selling it for more than, you know, you would need to like buy a really fucking fancy RV or whatever the hell. So yeah, that stuff is super real and very anger inducing. So you, kind of on the tip of this being kind of a rapidly escalating situation, and our world seems to be like, our paradigm seems to be like evolving very rapidly. In what ways do you see like eviction defense playing out or fitting into sort of like a radical praxis in the near-ish future?
Well, I guess the one thing that I would say to this is, and kind of one of the reasons why we're doing this interview, is to just kind of communicate to other people that like you can do this too. And it's going to take all of us to like participate in doing the thing that will get us free. It's going to take us all. So considering the conditions and like the conditions of COVID, just like what's happening electorally, like what's been happening in the streets, but also like most importantly, what has never stopped, like what has been ongoing. And I think when we talk about the uprising, it's not like an event that started in May, it's an ongoing thing that has never ended. So considering all of that, I think if people are like called to this work and called to just like, oh, this is something that I feel like I can do, or maybe like I know some people facing eviction, or maybe like I'm facing eviction myself, and kind of getting with people that you know, and if this is something that interests you, talking about how you can do the thing. And that's kind of why we put the handbook together, is to hopefully, like, as we were learning, we wanted to create a resource for others to maybe do it a little easier than we had to do it, and create some educational resources at the same time. I mean, and we definitely like kind of use like an affinity group-based model of organizing, which can be, you know, like admittedly like kind of hard to access sometimes. And I've like certainly been thinking of ways and talking with people about how you can like deconstruct that so people can kind of understand what that means. But it takes a focus, and kind of one of the ways that like we are like want to propose for other people to start doing this is through court support. And that's kind of showing up at the place where people are facing the violence. And that's the courts. Eviction courts are ongoing. They're happening, you know, almost like every day the court is in session. There's some part of the eviction process moving, and there's ways to get involved in that and like work towards solidarity with people facing eviction. So that is kind of one of the like practical material ways that people can start. And then in terms of like how to like maybe organize, like how would you organize an eviction defense? Like hopefully the handbook can speak to some of that, and it will be like available and online, and I guess we can like make that information, put that information out there. But it's also just one way that you can do it. And I think it's important to understand that there's a lot of things that people already know how to do that they could begin to start the process. But working with other people that you trust, that you know, is like a really solid first step, and beginning to offer like direct material support to people facing the violence.
Absolutely. Would y'all want to talk about your call for more sort of autonomous jail support infrastructure now?
Sure. Yeah, I think that was a great lead in to that. Olive and I worked on a little brief call, and I'll read some of it. Abolition is what we're working towards, and that means that direct material support is necessary and really urgent to build solidarity, especially this me editorializing, but especially thinking about the near future. I think that January 2021 is when a lot of things expire and when a lot of the mechanisms for sort of delaying the eviction process and giving people more time to pay rent runs out, and looking towards that as a time when this is going to be extra necessary and important in terms of housing and defending communities against displacement. Jail and court support are vital mutual aid projects that abolitionists across the country have been working on for many years now, but the uprising that began over this past spring and summer and that continues has shown a lot of other communities how absolutely necessary it is to support folks who are entwined with the so-called criminal justice system and the so-called justice system in general. And we look to Charlotte Uprising and their work holding down 24/7 jail support outside of the Mecklenburg County Detention Center as a model for what a community can accomplish when abolition is the goal and the practice is community care and mutual aid. And we saw the Mecklenburg County Sheriff Department really viciously repress the jail support that Charlotte Uprising was doing. And that was a testament to the power and effectiveness of that jail support as a mutual aid project and as a method for disrupting the violent and dehumanizing processes of the criminal quote-unquote justice system. And in solidarity with their tireless work and the work of other folks who have been doing jail and court support, we want to encourage abolitionists everywhere to work towards building jail and court support infrastructures in their local communities. Community bail funds and bailout days across the country are examples of what community care and mutual aid can look like in terms of supporting folks with interactions with jail and with the court system. And in our own communities, we've also seen repression of mutual aid around the jail and court system. We have seen during times when we've held jail support outside of the Wake County Detention Center, the Wake County Sheriff's Department lines up in riot gear and has cleared out jail support off of the empty lawn outside of the jail for absolutely no reason, other than that they're scared of what happens when the people that they kidnap and detain build solidarity and community with each other and with their communities. And isolation is really what protects the violence of courts and jails. As Ruth Wilson Gilmore says, abolition is presence. So we face down isolation with presence to confront the violence as it manifests itself in the so-called justice system. When the state attacks our communities, we attack back. And in the work of HEDS-Up, this goal has taken the form of eviction court support, which is sort of some of what Olive has talked about, being present outside of the courthouse with information, with copies of the Cdc Declaration, with coffee, just like being friendly people, going inside the courts to check the eviction docket and see who's doing the eviction, and also like through the process of court support, we're able to meet other folks in our community who are facing the violence of police in the state and to begin the process of building solidarity and community with the goal of leading to long-term community defense against the state and against racial capitalism. And oftentimes what we experience and hear and talk about at jail support and court support can be really dire and scary, whether it's people talking about their landlord trying to throw them out for being a week late on rent, or people talking about their experiences being brutalized by police during arrest and processing in jail. And having community present in these scary and dire situations helps take away the power that the court system and that jails wield over us to keep us feeling isolated and afraid.
I love that so much. Yeah, thank you so much for drawing such a apt and needed parallel between sort of eviction defense, community care, and jail support. Yeah, we've definitely been keeping eyes on the Charlotte uprising endeavors and like been really amazed that they've been able to hold it down for so long, and y'all too. So how can people learn more about HEDS-Up, support y'all if they can, and also like keep eyes on the release of your handbook to the public?
So you can find us. We're on Twitter and Instagram right now, and for that we're under Instagram is all one word, can't pay won't pay Durham, and the Twitter is can't pay won't pay DURM. You can find us at email, HEDS-Up, HEDSUP @protonmail.com is an email to reach us at. Let's see, we have a website. We're going to update it, and that is where we'll release the handbook. That is www.can'tpaywon'tpaydurm.org. And also, yeah, other, like projects in the Triangle, just like shout out to the folks in Raleigh who have been like keeping the fire lit throughout the summer. Definitely like very inspired by what's happening there, along with like my long-term comrades in Knoxville, Tennessee. So shout out to them.
So Olive and Yousef, those are all the questions that I had typed up. And thank you both so much for taking the time out of your busy days to have this chat with me. It was truly a pleasure to get to sit down with y'all and hear about what you've been doing and like hear about how you've been thinking about stuff. Is there anything that we missed that you'd like to touch on in closing, or any words that you would leave on with listeners?
I just want to thank you for making the time to talk to us and for the really great questions that you asked.
Thank you.
I super appreciate all of this. And yeah, if people want to get in touch, definitely encourage you to reach out, preferably over email.
Cool.
Is the best way to reach out to us.
Thanks y'all both so much, and let's definitely keep in touch. And that was our interview with Olive and Yousef, who are two Durham, North Carolina based organizers talking about the eviction defense platform HEDS-Up and their Eviction Defense Handbook, which can be found on their website, which is www.can'tpaywon'tpaydurm.org. You can also find them on social media. If you want to find them on Twitter, at them at can'tpaywon'tpaydurm, and Instagram is just at can'tpaywon'tpaydurham. To get in touch with them via email, which is the easiest way to get in touch with this group, just email them at HEDS-Up@protonmail.com, and HEDS-Up is spelled HEDSUP.